His was the only boat to arrive.
I think maybe it was a cow. I don't know.
There's a thank you letter from Lyndon Johnson.
There was even a monorail at one point to the east of us.
Plus, everybody forgets about pirates.
This is the coolest field trip I have ever been on.
I don't know, but I've been told, keep on dancing, won't ever get old.
Hello and welcome to the Long Island History Project, the podcast that brings you stories and interviews with people passionate about Long Island history. You can hear them all at longislandhistoryproject.org. My name is Chris Kretz. I am your host, and our opening music is courtesy of the Homegrown String Band. And yes, we do bring you interviews with people passionate about Long Island history, and that means all the Long Islands. We're on a quest to document the history of as many Long Islands as we can, so we are venturing out of the metropolitan area. Last time we found a Long Island up in Maine, and we found another one, and we will get the history of it from today's very special guest.
My name is Sharon Lutz. My maiden name is Pope, and I'm a fourth generation to own and operate the property that Long Island Beach used to be at, and still operating on the property as a recreation business like my grandparents did at Long Island Beach about 100 years ago.
And first of all, Sharon, thank you for coming on Zoom this afternoon with us. You're part of my quest to learn the history of all the Long Islands. So I usually talk about Long Island, New York, but as you mentioned, there's a Long Island Beach out there. Do you want to tell us where in the country you are and maybe a little bit of the surrounding area?
Sure. My property that was Long Island Beach is about 15-minute drive west of Cincinnati, right in the tri-state area. You can see northern Kentucky. I can be at southeast Indiana in a matter of a minute. So I'm right in the tri-state area. It's Hamilton County, Whitewater Township. Like I said, it's real close to Cincinnati, northern Kentucky, and southeast Indiana, right where the three states come together.
And the beach is you're on a river. Is that correct?
Correct. On the Whitewater River, which originates in Indiana, and there's only 8 miles of it that flows through the state of Ohio, west of Cincinnati.
So just to help us picture the scene, I guess, are you on site right now? Are you like at the...
I'm just 2 miles up from the site, yes.
Okay. So if you were on site, if you looked out, just describe kind of what it's looking like now, early summer.
It's just a scenic small river. It's actually the cleanest river in the state of Ohio, tri-state area, actually. It's misnamed river. It's the Whitewater River, which is misnamed. But it's just a real rural area close to the city of Cincinnati, but it's very rural. A lot of farmlands. My family is farms, thousands of acres of farms, and actually hundreds now. But yeah, it's just a rural area close to the city.
And is that where you grew up, around there?
Yes. Yes, I was born and raised at the Long Island Beach property, as my father and my grandfather also were. My great-grandfather bought the farm, I believe, like in 1888.
Yeah, so if you don't mind, let's go into that deep history. You say it's the Pope family. So how did they come to that area? How did they get into farming and that land?
My great-grandfather actually would shoe horses. I mean, he had owned a tavern. He and his one of his brothers had owned a tavern up in Cincinnati, and it was taken kind of like eminent domain to build a highway. And so they came out in 1888 west of Cincinnati and bought some farm ground not far from where they grew up. They were born and raised only about 15 minutes from the farm, and just started farming. But my great-grandfather actually would shoe horses that would work in Cincinnati, and the Cincinnati would bring out the horses. I don't know who he worked for, who he was hired by, but he would actually shoe the horses and let them rest and work on the farm to give their hooves a break before they would go back and work on the cobblestones of Cincinnati. So that's what brought them to the area to work on the farm. And then back in 1918, my grandfather and his first cousin, they were just young teenagers. They would actually start selling soft drinks to thirsty travelers that would come out of southeast Indiana, across the farm, across the Whitewater River, that would go into Cincinnati. It was the main thoroughfare. It's on Suspension Bridge Road is the name of the road that Long Island Beach was at. And it was the main road that connected Southeast Indiana to Cincinnati. So when the farmers and travelers would leave Cincinnati or leave Southeast Indiana to go into Cincinnati, they would sell them soft drinks along the road and allow them to come swim. And that's basically how Long Island Beach started.
And so it's on the east bank, right? If I read the map right.
Yes, correct. It was a full mile of beaches. There was a Long Island in the middle of the river, and that's how my grandfather named the attraction. But there was a mile of beaches that my family cleared, a mile or half mile downstream and a half mile upstream of the Long Island. So yeah, on the east bank of the Whitewater, correct.
And just to stick with the farming for a second, what do you know what they were growing? What kind of crops would they have been?
Soybeans and corn, field corn.
So when did it become like an official? It sounds like it kind of grew just from the travelers, but when did they consciously decide, hey, let's make this an attraction? And
The early 20s, like around right around 1920, because in 1918, my grandfather planted a lot of sycamore trees to make a picnic grove down in a section of the farm. So it was around 1920 that they started to charge people to come in and swim in the river. There'd be swimming, half the whole mile of swim on the beaches, but around 1920 actually.
So I would imagine they were starting to get a lot of automobile traffic. The cars were coming into fashion then.
Yes, on a given Saturday, there'd be 1,000 people coming from Cincinnati. There was actually a streetcar that came from Cincinnati that would go along the railroad tracks of our property. And so they would bring a lot of people from Cincinnati to come and visit Long Island Beach. That's how a lot of them came.
And it matches a lot of, so the 20s on Long Island, I'm on the South Shore, so we have the Great South Bay, and there's a lot of the history with the cars coming, a lot of restaurants and these kind of rest stops springing up and attractions for the people.
Yeah, there was absolutely nothing in this area in 1920, strictly farm ground.
What kind of did they just attract people by location, or were they taking out ads or billboards or?
Well, back in 1920, it would have just been word of mouth. But being that it was the main thoroughfare out of Southeast Indiana into Cincinnati, there would have been, quite a few locals that would hear about it. I honestly don't know how they would have advertised it. It was just kind of word of mouth. There weren't too many areas of attraction. So that's a good question. I don't know how they advertise it, but probably just word of mouth. Maybe some newspapers, I would think.
Yeah, I've searched a few, and I feel a few ads come up like from the 30s more about the campgrounds and things. So, what was the evolution of the site? So they had a beach and they had areas for people to park, but it looks like they kept adding to it.
Right. Bingo was a big attraction. There was a dance hall. That was a big attraction. I don't know if it was Friday night or Saturday night or both. They would have like Rosemary Clooney. Her sister, actually, Rosemary Clooney's sister lived right down the road. And before she made it pretty big, I guess, she would come in when she was in town visiting her sister. She would sing down at Long Island Beach of an evening. And then it was Spike Jones. And other big bands. My father told me there was multiple big bands, but he recalled Spike Jones and, of course, Rosemary Clooney on a rare occasion would come and sing. So there was the dance hall, bingo, the swimming, concession stands, picnics. And then later years, my grandfather built, I think it was 7 homemade camps on wheels. It was like little gypsy looking cabins. But that was in the later years, like in the 50s and 60s, that came along. And then it was big ball fields, tennis courts, ping pong tables, and everything was handmade by my grandfather and his 3 cousins. There were rides, Some of the rides hung from the rafters of the bridge, under the bridge, called like a Flying Dutchman.
Yeah, I saw a picture there. I mean, that's what have you seen, or do any pieces survive? I'm curious what else for rides did they have?
Nothing exists anymore. It's a shame, but it really doesn't. And probably the picture you saw of it looks like a ride going across the river. That is actually not the Flying Dutchman. That is a temporary contraption, I'll call it, that my grandfather's cousin built in order to make the swinging bridge. They made a swinging bridge that went from the riverbank out to the island, out in the middle of the river. And then that's how people would get from the property out to the Long Island, was a swinging walk bridge.
So when you described the dance hall, was that on the mainland or on the island?
It was on the mainland, right at the entrance of where you would come in. They also would rent bicycles. I mean, it was all types of recreation.
And so this was a Pope family business, basically, just run by the family?
Yes, owned and operated by my grandfather and his cousins. They worked in unison together.
I'm just curious, just to stick on the rides for a second. Do you know what else they would have built, like not Ferris wheels, I guess, but merry-go-rounds, or it just invented their own rides?
They invented their own rides. My grandfather's oldest cousin, Ed, he was the brains behind the homemade rides. He was something. But all the rides were hand powered. But you could get like 6 people on each side of this ride and get it hand powered and just get it spinning in circles, real fast. And I mean, none of these rides, of course, would be a permit, you could use nowadays, be dangerous.
But fun, probably.
Yeah, some of the rides people would get on, and then there'd be men down below pulling ropes to get it going faster and faster. Yeah, just a lot of fun.
One thing I did find in researching some of the old newspaper articles was how big baseball was, which is something we had in Long Island too. But it was great. It was like, I guess, I don't know if your family had a team, but they were playing Eddie's Donuts and Ed Miller's Garage. It was just local teams playing. Do you know anything about how baseball was played there, or who was playing?
I wish I could remember. There was a local boy, doggone it, last name of Nixon, but I'm not a baseball buff. I honestly can't recall the story. But yeah, there was some people that played that actually played, not professional, but close to it. I mean, they weren't just local kids playing ball. They actually came, some Cincinnati teams would come out and practice and actually play. And there was one incident a family story where somebody went and got my grandfather and said, hey, a large fight just broke out on the ball field. And my grandfather grabbed the tractor and the plow, and he plowed it up, and he said, that's it. And that was the end of the ball field. He said, there will be no fighting on my property.
Well, which kind of one question I was going to ask you, given the time frame when they started in the 1920s, did prohibition factor at all into anything, or was that an issue they had to contend with?
I really don't know on that. I know at a time, later years, alcohol was being brought in by patrons, and I'm sure my grandparents weren't too happy about that. But I would imagine people probably did. I mean, this was a German area. I mean, beer was was a staple. So I'm sure they did picnic with their beer.
But it was mostly a family establishment, it sounds like.
Yes, family establishment. But there were a lot of company picnics. There was one company picnic, but Fernald was a local large business in the area. And they'd have 1,000 people. They'd have their annual picnics. And on a given Saturday, there'd be over 1,000 people. But a lot of company outings, family reunions.
So how did things change over time? So let's say we're past the 30s, and I guess it was handed down through your family?
Yes. Once, actually, the island out in the middle of the river, the river changed the course a little bit. I just want to give a little history on the island itself. Interstate I-275 was constructed in the 70s. And when they built the piers, it kind of changed the course of the river ever so slightly. But the island itself no longer exists. It is now part of the riverbank. But after Long Island the beach property, the amusement park, I'll refer to it as, closed in the early 60s, it laid idle and just became farm ground again. The family farm did. And then in the late 70s, my father opened up a golf driving range and built a miniature golf. And that existed for a few years, and then it closed up, and it sat idle back in the farm ground once again. And then back in 1997, my husband and myself rebuilt the golf range and put a miniature golf back in. And then it's evolved from there, and now we're a kayak rental. And back to serving people on the Whitewater River. People now come back and rent kayaks from us and enjoy the Whitewater River. So it's kind of evolved from Long Island Beach, where people would come and pay to swim, to now they're paying to rent kayaks and enjoy the river.
That's great, and that it stayed in the same family. So as you walk the property, are there any signs of the old amusement park area, or is that long gone?
It's pretty much long gone. I mean, in my mind, I know where the dance hall was, the dance floor, the bandstand. You can still see some old pipes and concrete structures that used to be the center pole for the merry-go-rounds. A lot of the trees that my grandfather planted in 1918 are still growing, still on the property. But beyond that, there's really no sign of Long Island Beach anymore.
As a child growing up, it sounds like you knew this history, but how did the family talk about the old days, the amusement park? What did they pass down to you in terms of?
It was always referred to as the beach, the property down along the rivers, the beach. And I really didn't get a lot of stories. I was born in the mid-60s. So when I was a child, I was only visiting some of the people that were still camping. And I really didn't learn about the Long Island Beach until I was more of like a teenager and would start talking to my grandparents and asking them questions.
Is it known how big is it in the area? Like, do people remember it, or is it?
It's dying off. There's not that many people that still remember the old Long Island Beach, unfortunately. When I first started my business in the late 90s, people were coming in daily reminiscing, taking pictures, showing me pictures, reminiscing. And then now they would all be pushing in their 90s now. And
do you know anything? This would be a secondary question, but did you know anything about Long Island, New York?
You know what? I did. Like, I learned about that when I was a teenager, of course. But yeah, I always wondered. I thought, why didn't my parents name it Long Island Beach? And then my dad, told me that about the Long Island, literal island in the middle of the river. But no, I honestly don't know a whole lot about Long Island in New York, except that it's just a general location. I went to college and had a classmate from Long Island, New York. Kind of ironic.
Do you any chance what part, or any names spring to mind, places?
No, not really. Is that where you're at now, Chris? Long Island?
Yeah. So I'm on the South Shore. So we run east-west. So it sounds like your island ran north-south, right, in the river?
Yes, it ran north and south. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So we're sort of, if you're in New York City, we kind of run like not 90 degrees, but almost like a 45-degree angle going east from New York City. So a lot of beaches, a lot of shores. There's good kayaking. We have some good kayaking spots too.
I'd love to visit it sometime. Sounds neat.
So is there anything I haven't asked about Long Island Beach, or anything you want to let people know about the area or your family's history?
I'm not sure. I mean, I hit on it with, Rosemary Clooney and Spike Jones, and that was it. I know my grandfather did have a lot of, slot machines. And one funny story, his Pepsi salesman, beginning of the season, was just general conversation telling Grandpa about how there was a contest going on with Pepsi, that whoever would sell the most Pepsi, the salesman, would win a trip to Atlantic City. And so my grandfather he filled the entire barn full of Pepsi products for the entire season instead of just buying however it was weekly or however he bought it. He filled the barn with Pepsi products, and his salesman won the contest and spent his honeymoon in Atlantic City.
Ah, good for him.
So that's just kind of a fun story.
Yeah. Well, what's fascinating, one thing I picked up when you're talking about the horses, so it's we've through other stories we've talked about like how big the horse was, because Long Island was a big farming community up until World War II almost, and then you forget how horses powered everything back then, so like
right.
I can see how it would be important to have someone who can shoe the horses, and it's also interesting that you're so close to the city, so even back in the 1800s it was just a quick ride into Cincinnati and back.
Right, it wasn't far because the train actually is only half a mile away, the train track. And it was a depot just 2 miles away from the home. So, my grandparents would travel, the train into the city. And then the streetcar, of course, came out of the city and traveled the tracks, and just half mile from from our property. So yeah, getting into Cincinnati has always been very easy. But like I said, it's where my property is now is still very rural.
No, it's great that it stayed that way. Although it sounds like, so 275 you said, which came in the 70s.
Right, 275. Yeah, we're only half a mile off the exit.
And that sounds like it was a big change, or at least for the island, at least.
Huge change. As a child, I remember, sitting in my front yard and watching the construction of the interstate and family homes being raised. Some of them even moved. So watching the construction of I-275 was pretty major as a child.
And so what if you look north and south of Long Island Beach, what was life on the river? Were there other farms along the river or other people, neighbors?
Farms. It was all farms as a child, and then camps. Like I actually live in one of the camps my grandfather built in 1930, along the Whitewater River now.
Would those have been year-round cabins? Or it became year-round?
Yes, they started out as just summer camps, where people from the city would come out and rent the camps just to get out in the summer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean that's another. We have a similar development, camps that became more permanent and became villages and towns. This might be a strange question, but I just did a interview with someone about the Amityville Horror, which was a famous haunted house case on Long Island. Any local legends, or just from your area, your corner of Ohio? Growing up, what did you hear stories about? Tall tales or weird things?
Yeah. Well, here along the river, just about half a mile north of the old Long Island beach, there was an area called Little Egypt. And back in the late 1700s, there was a lot of Irish settlers, and legend had always been that there was a fog. There's always like a morning fog, and there would have been sightings of headless horsemen and people going missing. They'd go into this area of Little Egypt, it was called, and not ever be seen again. And it's even documented. Cincinnati Enquirer at the time in the early 1800s actually had it documented of people gone missing. So it's just kind of a fun, not really fun, but interesting legend of Little Egypt. But the reason people did go missing is if they would wander too close to the river in this one area. It was real swampy, and it was actual like quicksand, and you could get lost. And there was a canal, the Whitewater Canal, constructed that went through that area. And while it was being constructed, 3 of the men building the canal actually sunk in this quicksand and literally drowned, died. So that is an interesting thing real close to the family farm. Another real fascinating, just real close to here, is where the first prime meridian marker is for the state line. well, not for the state line, the first prime meridian marker, but it is actually on the state line for Indiana. And there was a Fort Finney with the Shawnee Indians, and where the treaty was signed. I'm trying to remember the year. I want to say 1795, but I could be off on that date. Or Fort Finney, where the treaty was signed with the Shawnee Indians, which is just a couple miles from here as well.
One last thing, because you mentioned the river. One of the things Long Island was known for was fishing and hunting, but fishing too. Was there fishing along the river too, or any particular type of fish?
Oh, yes. Yes. People still fish along the river. And the Whitewater River has, according to the Ohio EPA, 100% attainment of aquatic life. We've actually got some endangered species of fish out here that aren't found anywhere else, really, because it's just so clean. There's really no manufacturers draining into. There's not a lot of wastewater treatment plants, anything dumping into the river. It's all natural water coming out of tributaries.
Oh, it sounds beautiful.
It is.
I don't want to keep you longer. Last question. If someone's traveling west on 275, where do they get off to find you?
Exit 21, Kilby Road, Kilby. Kilby Road exit off of I-275, exit number 21.
Great. We know all about exits on Long Island too, so that will resonate with us.
I bet you do. Probably quite a few.
And thank you again to Sharon for speaking with us the other day. It's great to hear the story of the Pope family and how they've kept that land in the family for generations. And Sharon also shared with us that her children are continuing the tradition. They are taking over the property and will be operating it as the 5th generation of Pope family descendants along the east bank of the ironically not rapid-filled Whitewater River. Sharon was also nice enough to share one of the vintage photos of Long Island Beach back in the day, so you can see that along with this episode at longislandhistoryproject.org, where we will also list in our show notes links to more information, the reason why they called it Little Egypt, more about the meridian. We also ask, actually, 2 things. One, if you enjoyed this podcast, and we hope you do, please share it with a friend, whether they are from Ohio or Kentucky or Indiana or any other contiguous states. Help us spread the word that there is a podcast out there dedicated to Long Island history. And on that note, if you know of any other Long Islands beyond our own, please drop us a note, longislandhistoryproject@gmail.com. We do want to keep this little mini-series going, so let us know what Long Islands you've been to in your life. Our outro music was Capering by the Blue Dot Sessions, used under an Attribution 4.0 international license. That does it for another episode. As always, thank you for listening.